This is a soufflé. It's an egg-based food originating in France. It can be served as a sweet or savoury dish. And if you look at the recipe and technique for making a soufflé, it looks remarkably easy. However, if you've actually tried to make a soufflé, you will have found that it is far more difficult to get right than it first appears. The soufflé is also my rather lame metaphor for ToK Essay number 1, May 25. That's the one about the ethical obligation not to ignore contradictory evidence. Welcome to ToK Today. I'm Daniel, and today I'm going to explain my interpretation of ToK Essay number 1, May 25. That's the one about historians and human scientists having a moral obligation not to ignore contradictory evidence. And I'm going to talk through some of the key terms in this essay, some examples of knowledge claims, real-world examples, and evaluation points. I'll also explain some of the potential pitfalls. However, before we get started, I must give you fair warning that this is only my interpretation of the essay title, and many other interpretations are available. However, if you want more of my interpretation, be sure to pick up the student guidance notes for ToK Essay number 1, May 25, from the ToK Today store, link in the video description. Those guidance notes are like a mini textbook for this essay. They contain more ways to unpack the key terms, more knowledge claims, examples, and evaluation points. And if you're a ToK teacher, we have a teacher's resource pack just for you. More details on that link in the video description or from the support tab on the ToK Today website. Okay, let's get into ToK Essay number 1, whether human scientists and historians have an ethical obligation not to ignore contradictory evidence. Now, how do I say this politely and frame it in a positive context? Okay, here goes. This ToK essay gives us a near unique opportunity to extend our ToK thinking and ToK skills, even more than the other essay titles do. Yay! You see, on first reading, it seems fairly straightforward. Should historians and human scientists ignore contradictory evidence? And is that an ethical obligation? But with more careful reading, we see that that's not the question. The question actually is, do historians and human scientists have an ethical obligation? Do they have it? Do is a far more challenging, more opportunity-giving term than should. If the question was, should historians and human scientists have this ethical obligation, it would be easy to answer. But do they have it? I mean, is that do in an abstract, hypothetical or theoretical sense? Or is that do in the literal, written down, find it in a document sense? So I took over a month thinking about this essay title, researching it, reading about it, before I could write the student guidance notes and before I could make this video for you. And this essay title gave my brain a real workout, and that's why I've put a rather startled brain on the front of the student guidance notes. But have no fear, I think I've worked a way through it, and that's what I'm going to explain today. So let's start with the key terms: ethical obligation, do not ignore, and contradictory evidence. Now, as with all definitions in ToK, you need a more ToK-specific definition than a dictionary definition. How you develop your definition will determine the knowledge claims that you can develop. My recommendation for your definition of the term ethical obligation is that it should allow you to differentiate it from a methodological requirement or obligation. Something along the lines of a commitment or responsibility arising from an ethical code rather than from methodological convention or demands. And that's just an example. You'll be able to develop your own definition probably better than mine. Now, do not ignore could have more possible interpretations. I mean, what does do not ignore actually mean in practice? Does it mean merely acknowledge, or does it mean present alongside your research findings? Or could it mean adjust your research findings accordingly? And this is further complicated when we consider the range of ways to define contradictory evidence. I mean, is this the exact opposite of other evidence that you've already collected? Or is it the exact opposite of your research findings? Or is it just evidence that contrasts with evidence that you already have? Or is it evidence that has arisen from a different methodology? Now, you'll need to develop your definitions of these terms according to the AoK and knowledge claim that you're considering. You may decide to develop different definitions as your argument develops, and in many ways this essay is all about how you define these terms. So let's move on to knowledge claims. Essentially, I see this essay as asking the question, which is more important, ethics or methodology? And then whatever your answer is to that question, the follow-up question is that always more important? Are there circumstances in which the other one could be more important? Now, obviously, this is only my interpretation and other interpretations are available. But it's on this basis that I write my knowledge claims. An example of a knowledge claim for AoK history could be, historians have a limited ethical obligation to follow the directive, do not ignore contradictory evidence, when they're developing perspective-based oral histories. An example of a knowledge claim for AoK human sciences could be, human scientists have a strong ethical obligation to follow the directive, do not ignore contradictory evidence, when their research could be used for the development of social policy. And an example of a knowledge claim that could be used for a comparative analysis of both AoKs could be, the degree to which historians and human scientists have an ethical obligation to follow the directive, do not ignore contradictory evidence, is determined by the contextual demands of the research. Now, a couple of things on knowledge claims here. Firstly, you could write knowledge claims that cover both AoKs. Then you could write a compare and contrast across both AoKs. Or you could write separate knowledge claims for each AoK. So you would use one knowledge claim in AoK human sciences and then a different knowledge claim for AoK history. Both strategies could work. Secondly, these are just a few of the many, many knowledge claims that you could write for this essay. I'm only presenting these examples as the sort of knowledge claims that could be developed. I'm sure that you'll be able to write better knowledge claims than these. Okay, let's move on to look at the real-world examples that could be used for these knowledge claims, and we'll do that after these life-enhancing messages.
Last year, 9% of all IBDP students were awarded an A in ToK. What percentage of students using ToK Essay guidance notes do you think were awarded a grade A? 31%, 47%, or 72%? Well, if you chose 72%, you'd be correct. Yes, according to the ToK July results survey, students using ToK guidance notes were 8 times more successful than students not using the notes. You can pick up student guidance notes for essay number 1, May 2025, from the shop on the ToK website. Enjoy success with less stress in your ToK essay this year.
And ToK teachers, we haven't left you out. There's a teacher's resource pack available on the ToK website designed specifically to support teachers who are supporting students writing the ToK essay in May 2025. Okay, let's get on to the examples that we could use for our knowledge claim. Obviously, the examples that you choose will depend upon the knowledge claims that you write. So your examples will probably be different to mine if your knowledge claims are different. Now, my first knowledge claim is in AoK history, and it was, historians have a limited ethical obligation to follow the directive, do not ignore contradictory evidence when they are developing perspective-based oral histories. So I need to find an example in which a historian was using a qualitative-based, small-scale interview process to gather oral histories of people who have a specific perspective or experience. We're not interested in contradictory evidence because we're interested in the perspectives of a specific group of people with all of their inherent biases. We like those biases. We want them. So an example that I could use in this instance is the Millennium Memory Bank project. Now, this was an oral history project, which was a set of interviews conducted in 1998, 1999 with a diverse range of people in the United Kingdom. And the aim was to produce historical knowledge on the everyday experiences and events of communities at the turn of the millennium. The interviews are primary source evidence of the perspectives of the interviewees. Any contradictory evidence is of limited value to the aim of the research. If there's any obligation to consider contradictory evidence, it's a methodological obligation rather than an ethical obligation. Now, my second knowledge claim is in AoK Human Sciences, and it's human scientists have a strong ethical obligation to follow the directive "do not ignore contradictory evidence" when their research could be used for the development of social policy. So I need an example in which the research will be used to shape social policy, such as health, welfare, economic policy, or education policy. And in this case, I will use S. Srinivasan's 2011 research on the effects of free healthcare and pharmaceutical products for people in India. The research looked at the cost of providing free healthcare for all in India and the best ways to achieve this for the Universal Access to Healthcare plan. Now, in this case, ignoring contradictory evidence could have reduced the effectiveness of the government policy of free healthcare and consequently reduced people's access to healthcare. As such, we could argue that not ignoring contradictory evidence in this case is both a methodological and an ethical obligation. Now, my final knowledge claim is in both AoK History and Human Sciences, and it is the degree to which historians and human scientists have an ethical obligation to follow the directive "do not ignore contradictory evidence" is determined by the contextual demands of the research. So here I need to compare and contrast research in which there's an ethical obligation to consider contradictory evidence with examples of research in which there is not an ethical obligation. Now, this does not mean that there's not a methodological obligation. It's just that it may not relate to ethics. Examples of such research could be looking at research which is linked to identity, in which there would be a strong ethical obligation to consider contradictory evidence, and comparing it with research that's checking or confirming initial findings or searching for further evidence in order to consolidate and confirm initial findings. Again, I reiterate that the examples that you choose will be determined by the knowledge claims that you write. Okay, we're about to move on to evaluation points, and then we'll look at the potential pitfalls in this essay. So, the evaluation points that you develop will also very much depend upon the knowledge claims that you developed. I'll quickly run through some of the evaluation points for the knowledge claims that I've developed in this essay, but bear in mind that yours are likely to be different. So my knowledge claim number 1, it argues against the ethical obligation to not ignore contradictory evidence due to the aims of the methodology. And the evaluation of this point is the methodological versus ethical debate, which is the crux of this essay. So if we argue that knowledge has inherent value, regardless of the means by which it is produced, then we could say that any obligation to consider contradictory evidence is merely methodological rather than ethical. However, if we believe that the ways in which we produce knowledge is important and that there are ethical red lines, then we can argue that there is an ethical obligation regardless of the methodological aims. It's a means versus end argument, and this is even sharper and in more focus in knowledge claim 2. Now, knowledge claim 2 argues that the ethical obligation stems from the potential consequences of the knowledge produced. Now, of course, we could argue that all of the potential consequences of knowledge are essentially unknown. Many consequences are unseen or yet to be seen. Further, we could argue that consequences are constructed by humans, just like any other knowledge is constructed by humans. As such, consequences are a choice made by humans. And I would use Alfred Nobel's development of dynamite as an example here. Look it up if you don't know about it. Now, knowledge claim 3 applies to both AOKs, and it uses context as the determining factor. Now, the limitation of context arguments is that they rely on relativism, and there's a danger of falling into the mire of relativism here, and therefore not providing stable or satisfactory answers to the question. The range of contextual variables and their myriad forms of interaction means that using context as an answer effectively stops any analysis. So in conclusion to this evaluation section, we should acknowledge that this prescribed title goes to the heart of many of the big debates in philosophy. Whisper that, we're not meant to talk about philosophy. Now, some of those big philosophical debates are means versus ends, free will versus determinism, absolutism versus specificity, universalism versus situationalism. And these are big issues, many of which are far too broad to go into in your ToK essay, but they give an indication of the challenge, opportunity, of this essay. And that neatly brings us to our final section, the potential pitfalls of this essay. Remember at the beginning of this video, and I said that this essay gives us the opportunity to extend our ToK thinking and skills even more than other essay titles. Yay! Well, there's the big potential pitfall of this essay. There's a lot in this title. There's a lot to distract us from the main issue in the title. There are at least 3 clauses in this prescribed title. Do they have an ethical obligation? To follow the directive? Do not ignore contradictory evidence. Now, in my humble opinion, the essay isn't primarily about the directive, nor even about the types of ethical codes or structures. It's primarily about not ignoring contradictory evidence, and it wants you to look at that through a methodology versus ethics lens. The main potential pitfall here is that there's a lot there to distract you. Now, hopefully, now that you've watched this video, you won't be distracted. If you want more help and guidance, be sure to pick up the ToK Today student guidance notes from the ToK Today shop. They're like a mini textbook just for this essay. They include knowledge claims, examples, evaluation points, things that aren't covered in this video, lots that's not covered in this video. If you want a ToK coach to help you with your essay, just go to the ToK Today website, toktoday.com. And if you found value in today's video, I'd be grateful for a thumbs up, like, and if you want more great ToK content, I'd be incredibly grateful if you would subscribe. Thank you for coming along and watching today. Best wishes for writing your ToK essay, and stay ToKtastic, my friends.